Hi guys, I am Tracy. Please, make my story animated. How freelancing and working online has been pissing me off. Hi guys, I am Tracy, and I recently got into freelancing after losing my freedom. I was born into a family of 4 which were made up of my father, my mother, my brother, and me. My parents were very wealthy people who co-founded a tech company, Zenit. The company was worth an estimated amount of $300 billion and was comfortably seated as number 5 in the top 10 global tech companies. It was said that Rome was not built in a day, and neither was their company. My parents made it mandatory that every staff who worked for them in the company, or at home, was well acquainted with that fact. Zenit was born out of hard work, self-denial, and persistence, and they were not going to let people who lacked these qualities ruin the company. My dad had a background you would not envy. He never knew his parents because he was left at the doorstep of the orphanage home by an unknown lady. Life seemed unfair to him as the orphanage was no place to raise a proper child. However, fortune smiled on him when at the age of 2, he was adopted by the Freemans. Mr. and Mrs. Freeman had been married for 8 years without a child. They went through every medical procedure available at the time, and it was during one of those procedures that it was discovered that Mr. Freeman was sterile, and his wife, who had suffered from fibroid in the past, now had a damaged womb. The news came as a rude shock to this young couple, but they soon picked themselves up and decided to face life with every ounce of positivity. This led them to the adoption home, where they were soon enchanted by this cute little boy whom no one knew much about. All legal requirements were met, and this 2-year-old boy was taken home. A celebration was made to receive my dad, and people came to congratulate the Freemans. My dad was renamed Trevor by the Freemans, who loved him in no small way. Although the Freemans were not wealthy, they lived a comfortable life, and taking care of my dad was never a problem. Life treated my dad very fine until tragedy struck the Freeman family 3 days to his 18th birthday. The Freemans were returning from a picnic when they were robbed at gunpoint. The robbers equally made away with their life, and my dad, who was with them, sustained 2 gunshots to the chest. Luckily, he survived but had now become orphaned once again. My dad, who was now 18 years of age, couldn't go back to the orphanage, and so he began life as an independent adult. The Freemans left only enough to see him through high school, and so he had to take up several odd jobs in college just to make ends meet. It was while he worked as a cleaner in a restaurant that he met Patricia, the woman who would be his future wife. Patricia was a young, industrious woman who was getting set for college. She had parents who could fund the bills, but she wanted to gain financial independence from her parents, so she resorted to taking several jobs to generate money. She was a worker in the same restaurant as a dad, but Dad had been employed before she came seeking employment. Dad was assigned to teach them how to handle certain equipment, but it turned out she was no learner, as she had already worked 3 jobs before then. It was during this time that learned that my dad was already in the college which she was preparing to attend. This further drew them together, and they soon found themselves falling for each other. Dad was the first to make the move. He was thrilled by the fact that Mom, who had parents who could foot her college bills, still chose to work. She was different from other ladies. One time when she was cleaning the storage room, she tripped over a bucket and was headed straight for the floor. But Daddy's timely intervention saved the day. He had caught her before she could hit the floor, and while she was still searching for the words to say thank you, he quickly rewarded himself with a kiss. The kiss was all the trigger she needed, as she immediately pulled him close and started reaching for his buttons. She cared less if someone walked. Dad had lit a flame in her which needed to be put out. This was the birth of something that would last for a lifetime. Their relationship blossomed. Mummy often supported Dad with the little savings she made. While she was a freshman in college, Dad was a year ahead of her. But it was not an issue. Although they lived apart, she would sometimes spend the weekend at his place, so he could assist her with some school work. They inspired each other, but I think Mom inspired him more. She was always thinking ahead. It was in Dad's final year, after the school failed at the implementation of digitized courses, that she suggested they start up a technological firm that would offer both hardware and software solutions to individuals and firms. Although this idea had great potential, they both knew it required the kind of capital that they didn't have, but were determined to try. All the same, so while Dad graduated and sought funds, a Mom who was now in her finals drafted up the structure of the organization. Upon Mom's graduation, Daddy proposed, and 6 months later they were married on a very simple occasion. Having made their union official, they resolved all the more to make sure that they succeeded. This made them take the decision not to have children until certain things were put in place. For a company that was just in its infancy and lacked a physical location, they found it very difficult getting clients even though the competition was very little. They made and distributed business cards that only drained the little capital at hand. They tendered business proposals that were meant to create partnerships with several institutions, only to be turned down over and over again. Their breakthrough finally came when a friend of her dad who ran a private college institution needed some supplies and installation. This marked a turning point in their career, and they have consistently worked at the development of the firm. 3 years after their first major business deal, Mom and Dad decided it was time to make babies, and upon their first trial, they had twins. My brother and I, that was all the kids they were willing to have. My brother took after my parents. He always sought independence from infancy. He would rarely allow anything done for him even though we had staff at home who were there to attend to our needs. This greatly pleased my parents. They saw his attitude as a statement that he didn't take their efforts for granted. My mom saw much of her in him. She knew this boy could survive even without his parents' wealth and influence. I, on the other hand, gave them great concern. I was the direct opposite of my brother, and who it was that I had taken after, they couldn't tell. My parents were both hard workers who never allowed their wealth to negatively affect the way they related with people. So they couldn't understand whose gene flowed in me. I was the definition of laziness. Over time, I had perfected the art of laziness that if you didn't want something done, just give it to me. I enjoyed the privileges I had. I was bossy to the staff around, and I loved doing my thing in my own time, which I never had because I was busy doing nothing. If I had my way, I would compel someone to spoon-feed me, bathe, and clothe me. The only relief my parents had was the knowledge that I wasn't too lazy to breathe. Yeah, it was that bad. Unlike my brother, I always exhausted my monthly allowance before the week ran out. My grades were not so bad. At least they were not the worst in class, but neither were they as good as that of my brother who always came top of the class. At 16, we were both in our final year in high school, and our parents were throwing a party to celebrate the company's 20th anniversary. Several renowned people in the society would be there. Top politicians were among the special guests of honor. It was a week before the party that our parents informed my brother and me that we would be given the opportunity to each present a 20-minute speech before everyone present. This speech would feature which career path we had chosen, and how it would directly or indirectly influence the growth of the company. They, however, failed to inform us that the audience would be allowed to ask us questions based on what we had said. It was a day I didn't look forward to, but I knew that I wasn't ready to have my monthly allowance denied me because I let my parents down. The day finally arrived. As expected, it was colorful and everything was put in place to ensure that the event went according to plan. As expected, the high and mighty were there. The anniversary was being aired live, and so everyone was expected to be their best. Things moved smoothly until it was time for the children of the founders of the company to make their speech. We had to submit our written speeches 15 minutes before we were called up to make them so that they could be duplicated and distributed to the guests. My brother was up first. He said he had long decided to take a career path in software programming, so that way, he could work in the company, become directly involved in writing software programs which the company could sell to generate funds. As expected, there was applause from the crowd, and a guest asked what inspired him to take a path in line with the family business. We all listened as he said that he got passionate about the family business over time as he saw how dedicated my parents were towards the growth of the company. This inspired him to take steps that would prolong the legacy of the family long after my parents were gone. This response further evoked applause from the crowd. You could see my parents swelling with pride. It was now my turn to impress everyone, especially my parents. My brother had made them proud so many times, and I was prepared to make this my first. And the world who were watching would see just how great the kids of the great tech company were. I started my speech by telling them that the company which they had gathered to celebrate was not just founded as a means out of poverty, but its primary aim has always been to make humanity better, bring us closer, and then make life easier. Zenit was founded to bring a digital solution to the digital problems, both hardware and software which existed then and still does now. I made them understand that money was just a byproduct of the solution, and that's why Zenit had made so much of it even though it was never the chief aim. I further stated that my choice of career did not stem from the desire to amass wealth, but it came from the philosophy of my parents' company, which was to bring solution in every legitimate means possible to every aspect where humanity greatly suffered, which was why I would be going into politics. And although it had no direct relation to the family business, I was going to help defend the interest of citizens, thereby creating a legacy which had its roots in my parents' legacy. And whenever I am spoken of, people will agree that I was the personified legacy of my parents in the government. I marveled at the things I said, but my parents were more stunned. This was a part of me that they had never seen, thought about, or dreamt of. They didn't seem to mind the fact that I had just told the world that I wasn't going to be directly involved in their business. What mattered to them was the fact that I was going to use my life for something meaningful and productive. I never saw coming what happened next. A standing ovation from everyone almost led to my collapse. I never knew I could say what I had just said. This was my moment of glory, and I was going to bask in it. After the applause had died down, the wife of a serving senator asked a question. She wanted to know why a freelancing company was thanking me for patronizing them and hoped to do business with me again. I felt stupid. I was stupid. I had employed the services of a freelancer to help me prepare a script, and when it was delivered to me through my email, I just printed it out. I had about a week to go through it, but I was too lazy to do so, otherwise I would have noticed the message of gratitude at the bottom right of the paper. I bowed my head in shame as I walked off the platform and made straight for my room. I had embarrassed my family in front of the whole world. How my parents handled the rest of the night I could not tell, but I know that the party ended rather quickly, and on a sad note too. The next day, newspaper headlines and television channels made matters worse. It was a field day for journalists, who were paid by rival companies to spread the news that the daughter of the giant tech firm called Zenit was a scam. My parents' company temporarily lost investors at a fast pace. The company's board of trustees was made up of 6 shareholders. My dad, my mom, Mr. Jack, Mr. Kent, Mr. Roberts, and Mr. McCarthy. My dad had 20% shares, my mom had 20%, and the rest of the board members each had 15% shares. Mr. Jack had been a shareholder in the company for over a decade. He was in my dad's class back in school, and they both graduated the same year. He initially ventured into the same line of business when he saw how the company was making rapid progress. His startup company did well at the initial phase because he had the means to raise the capital needed at its inception and few human connections, which gave him little influence. However, my parents' company had already established its own presence in the market, and it soon became very clear to Mr. Jack that his company lacked what it took to make it. While realizing that his company was on the verge of collapse, he then decided to approach my parents for a merger. My parents accepted the merger, but it only got him a 15% stake in the company. That way, his clients became that of the company, and it further led to the growth of the company. He became disturbed when investors began pulling out in droves. Mr. Kent was a multi-millionaire who initially made most of his wealth from agriculture. Agriculture was his life. He was deeply committed to farming that he saw marriage as a distraction. Although he wasn't married, he had a son from a harlot, and he raised him on the farm, in the hopes that he would take over someday. He had various ranches scattered all over the country. He was strategic about his business, and he only made friendships that greatly favored his business. He became a shareholder in Zenit 5 years ago, so he could use the income generated to further invest in his agricultural business. As you would guess, he found the thought of losing investors a hard pill to swallow. Mr. Roberts was fondly called Rob, and as it suggests, he was a robber. Mr. Roberts was a gambler who owned a popular casino that was situated in almost every state in the country. Sought opportunities in everything. He offered help only when saw an opportunity to exploit. He never put his money where there was no chance of multiple returns. He has been a shareholder with the company for 5 years simply because he saw it as good business. As a gambler, he knew it was time to pull out when the company started losing investors. As for Mr. Mackenzie, he had been with the company for over 15 years. He was not just a shareholder, but he was a staff at the company who genuinely wanted the success of the company. He was one person my parents always appreciated having around because of his sincerity and integrity. He had a real estate company he co-founded with his wife, but he left her to manage it while he worked for my parents at Senate. He was the only one who was concerned not just for the money and investors who were leaving, but for my parents' legacy too. It was his concern for the company that made him call the attention of my parents to the fact that the other investors were thinking of selling their shares to the chairman of the company's rival. Mr. Pablo. Mr. Pablo founded a rival company called Apex. He was a man who was known to delve into every kind of business that brought in money, and it didn't matter how. Rumors had it that his tech company called Apex was only an umbrella that covered his dirty line of businesses that gave him the major part of his wealth. He was rumored to be into drugs, human trafficking, and every kind of illicit business you could think of. He always found a way to evade the law. He was a 3-time divorcee who was repeatedly accused of domestic violence. He had children that he couldn't account for. His hatred for my family and our company began 5 years ago when a client whom he had supplied inferior products to had he taken to court, and the client ended up seeking my dad's services. Mr. Pablo claimed that my dad was responsible for everything, and ever since he constantly sought ways to get back at us. He finally got his opportunity when I messed up, and he tried buying the shares of the major stakeholders of my father's company. So that way, he could take over our company. When my parents learned that Mr. Rob had already sold his share to Mr. Pablo, my dad quickly bought that of Mr. Kent, while my mom bought that of Mr. Jack. This quickly aborted the plan of Mr. Pablo, who would have to wait till when next I opened another window of opportunity. It was 3 weeks later, after my dad had sued the journalists who had spread the lies about my parents trying to use their kids to manipulate people into investing in the company, that they confessed to being paid by no other than the Apex chairman, Mr. Pablo. My dad wasted no time in taking him to court, and it was then all the terrible deeds he had been involved in began coming to light. Families and individuals who couldn't get justice in the past against Mr. Pablo were now coming forth to testify against him with heartbreaking evidence. There was no escaping from Mr. Pablo this time around. The judge ruled against him. He was sentenced to life in prison and made to forfeit all his assets to the government, who will use them to compensate his victims. The court equally ruled that the shares he had bought in our company will be forfeited to the company, who would then distribute it to its shareholders. There was a buzz in the whole country. The next day, newspapers carried the headlines, "The Apex Predator is gone." They labeled my family as the heroes of society, who helped the voiceless masses get justice. Some said that it was the window of opportunity that I created that led to the downfall of Mr. Pablo. This caused investors to rush back in, and they were so much that the company had to turn down hundreds of them. In the space of 2 months, the company witnesses a 300% growth. It was clear I had almost ruined their legacy. They ignored me for the period when they were trying to clear my mess while thinking about the kind of punishment I deserved. I knew an apology would do no good, as I had apologized too many times without making a change, so I patiently waited for the inevitable. My punishment came in a way I never expected. I had the staff assigned to me all withdrawn from me permanently. My allowance was off. I had to eat whatever was on the menu for that day. To crown it all, I had to take up a freelancing job in writing. The very thing I had used to embarrass the family. I was made to undergo a 2-month writing course, so I could be taught what I needed to know about writing articles, scripts, speeches, and whatever it was that I would be writing. 2 months went rather fast, and I was now ushered into a world of excruciating torture and pain. Yes, work for me was torture and pain. Since it was a freelancing job, I was made to work from home. That way, I was constantly monitored. There was just no escaping it. I could only spend the money I earned. No sooner had I begun before I discovered how difficult freelancing was, especially when you were working remotely. I had a hard time getting hired even though I joined multiple freelancing platforms. In every platform I joined, there were already professionals who had years of experience and a very attractive portfolio, so clients would always choose them over one who was a novice and just starting. It took me about 3 months before I was eventually contacted by a prospective client who backed out after stating that I lacked the needed experience to handle his project. The next prospective client, who almost awarded me his contract, became skeptical after she checked my profile and discovered that I was the infamous daughter of the owners of Zenit. It was frustrating. Really frustrating. I got lucky when a 14-year-old student contacted me. He wanted me to write a 10,000-word essay on a topic that I was needed to research before I could write it. I was ecstatic. I knew I had hit a gold mine. A 10,000-word essay was going to pay me just enough money to enjoy a bit of luxury. It had been almost 6 months since I last spent money the way I wanted, but after this gig, I knew things would temporarily get better. He needed it in about a week, and even though I never saw the possibility of having it ready in 2 weeks, I wasn't going to watch this money pass me by. So I told him I could have it ready then. I got mad when he told me that he was only able to pay $10. $10? What in the world would I do with $10? When I was still on a monthly allowance, I had usually spent $200 in a day. And yet it wasn't even enough. How can I now spend 7 days working just for $10? I quickly ended the conversation. I was now very frustrated. It had been a while since I last spent money on myself. I couldn't go to my brother for help as he was already forbidden from giving me money or helping me out with my work. Out of desperation, I quickly accepted an offer of $30 from a client who wanted a 20,000-word essay on global warming. He needed it in 4 days and demanded that I sent him the progress at the end of each day. I had always hated routine, but for the sake of $30, I had to keep up. I never liked being bossed around. No, I was used to giving orders. This new development was one that I wasn't going to get used to anytime soon. It took me an additional 3-day period to complete the project, but on the 7th day, I discovered that he had already requested that the platform call off the contract, which was in escrow, due to my inability to meet up on the 4th day. I had just wasted 7 days of my time, and I could not take it anymore. By my own estimation, I had suffered enough. I knew that the only way out of this was if my parents lifted the ban. My family had regained the love, respect, and admiration of the masses because the apex predator was now behind bars where he would be spending the rest of his life. And I had a part in that. I thought it was only fitting that my parents restored my lost glory. I made up my mind to speak to them about it for the first time since I began serving punishment. I hadn't bothered pleading with them when they dished out my punishment, because I knew I had messed up, and felt guilty about it. But all I felt now was frustration and more frustration, so I decided to speak to plead with my parents. I walked up to them immediately after they got back from work. I had barely begun stating my frustration when the tears rose from within me. Although you could barely hear what I was saying as my words were now mixed with tears. My mom and daddy perfectly understood the situation. But to my amazement, they just stood there smiling. They didn't show any sign of sympathy. It seemed as though they enjoyed my misery. Well, I guess they would because I had caused misery too. I was only getting served with what I deserved. When I discovered that I had not allowed them to say something yet, I quit talking but continued sobbing. By now, I had already created a scene, and the whole staff in the house just watched and enjoyed the drama. I knew that they would be glad to see me cry. After all, I had made life almost unbearable for them all. Each one of them had a tale of woe that I had scripted. Finally, my dad said that there were various reasons for their decision, and the very first was to make me understand that in life, actions would always have consequences. The ban placed on me was to make me finally appreciate those around me who helped me in one way or the other. It would finally cause me to value money, and watch how I spend it since I would only have what I had worked for. Finally, the ban would make me rise beyond laziness, and get things done for myself. It was at this point that he then said that the ban would remain in force. No more monthly allowance for me till I got into college, and no staff will be reassigned to me even after I got out of college. I fell to the ground, crying as they both walked past me. Hey guys, what would you do if you were me? What would you do when you realize that you have lost your privileges because of laziness? What steps do you think I should take to change the minds of my parents?